Microdosing is when you derive the maximum benefit from taking the minimum effective dose. This is how you minimize unwanted effects. People microdose daily to feel and perform better. I use it to enhance my creativity, to sleep better, and manage my anxiety. Today's podcast is sponsored by Microdose Gummies and Lumi Labs. Microdose Gummies deliver perfect entry-level doses of THC that help you feel just the right amount of good. I love this company, and I'm a big fan of their products. I put a tremendous amount of effort into my career, and I invest all my free time into producing this podcast. So I enjoy taking microdose gummies on the weekends so I get really refreshing sleep. And I need it because I don't get any quality sleep during the week. The gummies are organic, infused with real fruit, gluten-free, and they are enjoyable. Microdose is available nationwide. To learn more about microdosing THC, go to microdose.com and use code BEYOND to get free shipping and 30% off your first order. Links can be found in the show description. But again, that's microdose.com and code BEYOND.
This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
A commercial-free version of this podcast is available on Patreon for $1 per month. Patreon.com/Beyond Contempt Podcast. I'm Renee, and this is Beyond Contempt True Crime. This episode was listener requested. If you would like to make a case recommendation, please reach out to me on social media, or I have a contact form on my website, beyondcontemptpodcast.com. You're listening to episode 80, Neil LaFave. On Friday, September 24th, 1971, a 32-year-old man named Neil LaFave from Little Suamico, Wisconsin, was missing. He worked for the DNR for about 9 years and was a technical aide. His wife Peggy was looking for him and found his truck on a dirt path just off Sunset Beach Road in the Sensiba Wildlife Area. He had been posting no hunting signs in the nature preserve. Peggy reported her husband missing. It was an all-hands-on-deck type of situation. Officers formed a search party and showed up with hip boots, flashlights, and walkie-talkies. Neil's wife Peggy had a surprise party planned, as it was his birthday. She really hoped that her husband had gone out with his friends, and that was the real reason she couldn't find him. But deep down, she knew that most of his friends were searching for him. Plus, Neil knew that whole wildlife area like the back of his hand, so he likely wasn't lost. They found one of Neil's cigarettes by his toolbox, right next to his truck. It looked like he barely smoked it, and he was known for smoking his cigarettes down to the end. Everyone searched into the night, but then law enforcement called it off at 1 a.m. and resumed the search again at 6 a.m. Some of Neil's friends didn't stop and searched for him the entire night. The next morning was misty, but it lifted quickly as 100 officers scoured the wildlife area. Search planes from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Bureau of Game Management, Oshkosh, and Austin Straubel Field flew over the wildlife area. There was a person manning an airplane who was flying low and looked for anything out of place. The pilot spotted footprints in a muddy area, and it gave off the appearance as if something had slipped into the water. One searcher used a pole hook to probe the water, while another searcher stripped down to his shorts before he entered the water. Nothing was recovered. A bloodhound search and rescue dog and the dog's handler joined the search that day. The wildlife area was hard to maneuver through, with all the brush and overgrowth. One pilot radioed to an officer on the ground and said that a particular area would be ideal to dump a body had someone run into foul play. Peggy LaFave was on the ground, in earshot of that communication between the pilot and the officer. Tears ran down her face as she thought of their young adopted children, Nicole age 2 and Lonnie age 4. At 10:45 that Saturday morning, Hunter Bob Donnie from Ashwaubenon found Neil LaFave. Bob wasn't part of the search party and had been bow hunting that morning. When he learned about the missing DNR warden, he assisted with the search. About a quarter mile off of Sunset Beach Road, Bob saw a pile of fresh dirt with ferns and a log stacked on top of it. It looked out of place, so Bob started digging. Initially, he saw a belt, then an elbow. The missing man was lying on his side, so Bob called for help. Neil's body had been placed in a shallow grave in the Sensiba Wildlife Area, and he had been shot and covered with a few inches of dirt. There were spots of blood in that area, and there was a path that looked like something or someone had been dragged through the underbrush. The most disturbing thing was that Neil's head was missing. The area was immediately closed off for the state crime laboratory officials. Neil's body was transported to St. Mary's Hospital in Green Bay for the autopsy. Neil had been a well-liked person, but being a game warden, he naturally had conflicts with hunters. A lot of deer poaching went on in that area. That afternoon, investigators had already interviewed every person who hunted in the woods that day, and even a poacher who LaFave had written a citation for. Law enforcement asked several of these men to take lie detector tests. Only one man refused, and he was the person who LaFave had arrested in the past. His name was Brian Hussong, and he had a history that included violence. In grade school, he bashed another kid's head into a cement sidewalk, and he once snapped the neck of a kitten that was purring in his lap at a party. There had been both .22 caliber and .30-06 shell casings found at the crime scene. Law enforcement was confident that Brian Hussong was the man who committed the murder, but they didn't have the proof. District Attorney Donald Zoidmulder knew that the .22 rifle would be long gone. Hussong probably dumped it, as they were a dime a dozen. But the prosecutor felt Hussong didn't toss the .30-06, as those were harder to come by. If they could find the .30-06, then they could prosecute Brian Hussong for the murder. In 1971, telephone wiretaps were newer technology, and they were mostly used at the federal level for significant cases. To even get the court to approve a 72-hour wiretap, the district attorney had to prove that the phone number was in the suspect's name or they used the phone regularly. Then, the prosecutor had to show how the phone would be used for illegal activity. Law enforcement had an officer dress up as a flower delivery person. They went to the house where Brian Hussong and his girlfriend were staying. When Hussong answered the door, the undercover officer asked him for a phone number so he could verify that he had the correct address. Now the investigators had 72 hours to get Hussong to use the phone for something illegal. The DA secured warrants for Brian Hussong's aunt and grandmother's homes. Investigators believed that the grandmother had lied about Hussong's alibi. They openly followed him around town to make him nervous and hopefully put pressure on him so he would call someone about the .30-06. 2 days into the 72-hour wiretap, Hussong called his grandmother. He told her not to let anyone have the .30-06 that she was hiding at her house. She reassured her grandson that the rifle was hidden so well that no one would ever find it. Detectives showed up at Grandma's house, and she claimed that she knew nothing about the rifle. They continued to question Hussong's grandmother, so she changed her story and said her daughter had picked up the gun earlier that day. Investigators then drove to the home of Hussong's aunt. She had the Remington .30-06, which was disassembled and wrapped in 3 packages. On December 15, 1971, police arrested 21-year-old Brian Hussong. In January 1972, Hussong's attorney asked the judge to reduce his client's bond, which was set at $75,000. Hussong couldn't afford to pay his bond, and he had been sitting in the Brown County Jail in Green Bay. The defense tried to make their case that the criminal complaint was insufficient, but the judge ruled that probable cause had clearly been established. At a preliminary hearing, the prosecution called witness Norman Hicks to the stand. Norman was a DNR warden, and in October 1970, he had filed a complaint against Brian Hussong for a game violation in the Sensiba Park, based on information he received from Neil LaFave. Hussong was arrested, but was found to be innocent of the charges. In 1971, Hussong ran into game warden Norman Hicks in the parking lot of a Swamico tavern. He promised he would settle the score with all the DNR employees involved in his arrest. Another witness, Brown County investigator Wayne Tutman, testified about the 4 sites at the crime scene that contained evidence related to Neil's murder. The first site was north of Sunset Beach Road, and investigators found large amounts of blood, disturbed foliage, glasses, an eyeglass case, a shattered pair of sunglasses, a piece of paper, and 2 spent .22 caliber shell casings. There was an S-shaped path of blood and bent foliage that led to the next site. Site 2 was 58 feet to the north of Site 1. There was blood splattered on trees up to a height of 5 feet. Investigators found white matter that was likely brain tissue that had been covered by ferns. They also found a bone fragment and a tooth. The third site was 28 feet north of Site 2 and contained Neil LaFave's body. Neil's head was discovered at the fourth site. Investigator Tutman found several shell casings from a .22 and a .30-06 and metal fragments which were picked up at various sites and were analyzed by the State Crime Lab in Madison, Wisconsin. The investigation team had to clear all the vegetation in a 300-square-foot area and used metal detectors to scan for bullets and fragments. There were 2 theories about what happened on the day of the murder. The first theory has Hussong hiding in the woods waiting to ambush Neil as he posted signs. He might have even watched Neil from his grandmother's property that was nearby. The theory continues that Hussong shot Neil with a .22 and then walked to his grandmother's. He picked up a shovel and his .30-06. Hussong returned to the crime scene and used those tools to decapitate the game warden. The second theory paints the crime as being one driven by rage. Neil LaFave confronted Brian Hussong when they were in the woods. During the exchange, Neil pulled out his notepad to write a citation, and Hussong lost it. He shot Neil LaFave with his .22, then retrieved his .30-06 and shovel. He shot several times into Neil's neck, then used the shovel to remove the victim's head. Either way, the theories didn't matter, as law enforcement had the rifle linking Brian Hussong to the crime, and murder charges were formally filed on January 31st, 1972. Peggy LaFave collected donations at Neil's funeral and scraped the rest of the money together for a granite marker that was placed at the entrance to the Sensiba Wildlife Area in honor of her late husband. She was living paycheck to paycheck at that point, and coming up with $1,200 was a stretch. But Peggy was accustomed to not having a lot of money. When she was in high school, Neil went to Marine Reserve training in California. 6 months later, Neil returned to Wisconsin. Peggy finished up high school, and they got married later that summer. The couple had little money. They didn't have furniture or many possessions. When friends came over, they would play board games and serve popcorn with Kool-Aid. But that was the past, and now Peggy was a 30-year-old widow who had 2 young kids. Peggy wasn't the only one to honor her late husband. In February 1972, the Pine Hills Recreational Area in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, had an annual snowmobile race and dedicated it to Neil LaFave. He was an avid snowmobiler and loved the Pine Hills race. Brian Hussong's trial began on April 3, 1972. They whittled 94 prospective jurors down to 5 women and 7 men. The defense tried to change venues, but the judge denied it. They sequestered the jury when the court was not in session. Prosecutor Donald Zoidmulder warned the jury that this case was complex before he called his first witness. Willard Allen was a rural mail carrier who witnessed Neil posting signs along Sunset Beach Road about 1 p.m. on September 24, 1971. Neil's supervisor, Harold Shine, had assigned him to post the signs in a popular spot where waterfowl were hunted. Harold estimated that it should have taken 1.5 hours to post the signs in that area. When LaFave didn't return home that night, Harold received a call from Peggy LaFave asking about her husband. Harold Shine drove out to the Sensiba Wildlife Area around 8 p.m. on that Friday night. There were some boot tracks he followed, but he could not find Neil. There had been 2 young hunters that were out until dark. They had heard no shots for the duration of their time in the woods. Peggy LaFave testified she planned a surprise party for her husband at their home, which was about a mile north of the wildlife area. After she called Neil's boss, she involved the police. Peggy said that Neil wore prescription glasses or sunglasses and carried no books and pens, which were some of the items found at the crime scene. Peggy knew Neil had run-ins with Brian Hussong in the past, but the judge would not let her speak further on the topic as he deemed it hearsay. Brian Hussong's mother testified that her son was at home with her on the night Neil LaFave was murdered. Mary Hussong said Brian came home at 10:45 a.m. on Friday, September 24, 1971, and they ate lunch together. Then he went T-shirt shopping at 1 p.m. and returned home around 1:40 p.m. Brian was there about 10 minutes before he left for Larry Fink's home on 13th Avenue, where he had been staying with his girlfriend. Brian went back to his mom's at 2:40 p.m. and helped her can tomatoes. They finished around 4:15 p.m. His younger brother came home from school and showed him a crow he had shot earlier that day. Brian left around 4:30 or 4:45 p.m. He was wearing a gold shirt and black pants. Brian had a beard that had been growing for 2 weeks on a bet. Larry Frank confirmed Brian arrived at his house around 6:30 p.m., changed his clothes, and was clean-shaven. When Mary Hussong was cross-examined, she couldn't recall a phone call she had with her son last December about the statement he was going to give to police officers. Law enforcement wiretapped their conversation and heard their discussion about his alibi. Mary said that her testimony was not influenced by what her son told her to say. She also admitted that her husband worked in a garden that was on a property next to the north end of Sensiba Wildlife Area. Brian was familiar with the garden tools that were stored at that location. Mary said her son never brought her any out-of-season game and never told her that Neil LaFave had arrested him in 1970 for shooting pheasants out of season. Brian's father, Leon Hussong, said his son did not own a .22 caliber rifle at the time of the murder. Their family had been shooting a pellet rifle at a cabin near Lake Tomahawk weeks after the murder, and this was not to be confused with a .22. Leon also owned a rifle, which he gave to the state crime lab. The lab had marked large letters CL on the stock of the weapon, which Leon could not remove. Brian wanted to hide his guns from the police because he did not want them ruined like his father's gun. Melanie Davister was Brian's sister, and he was at her home on Sunset Beach Road, across from the Sensiba area, about 9 a.m. on September 24, 1971, when he stopped over to feed his dog that he kept there. Her husband, Keith Davister, said Brian later went crow hunting with a shotgun and left about 10:15 a.m. Melanie said that there was a blue Ford parked on Sunset Beach Road with its blinkers flashing and a motor running but no one inside about 8 p.m. on September 24. She saw a motorcycle stop at their driveway, and a man ran into the woods about 9 p.m. The motorcycle was left on her property, but was removed about 2 weeks later. Janice Obie was Brian's girlfriend, and she lived at Larry Frank's house with Brian. He dropped her off at work at 7:45 a.m. and called her around 11 a.m. She took the bus home around 5:45 p.m. and saw Brian again. He was wearing the same gold shirt and black pants he had on in the morning. He also still had his beard. Janice thought he had kept the beard until December. In October 1970, she said her grandmother sold Brian a .22 caliber rifle, but someone had stolen the gun that same year. Brian had been at a tavern in De Pere, and someone took the rifle out of the back of his car. When Janice was cross-examined by the prosecution, she admitted she testified at a John Doe hearing a few months prior, and she said she actually didn't know where Brian's guns were. Janice didn't know if this testimony took place before or after Brian took his shotgun and rifle to his grandmother's house to hide them from authorities. The defense planned to call 2 female witnesses to testify about alleged infidelities committed by Neil LaFave. The judge would not allow this, as he felt it might prejudice the jury and hinder their ability to find the truth. He felt it outweighed the right of the defendant to present alternative motives to the crime. The defense attorney asked the judge to dismiss the charges, as there was no direct evidence placing his client at the crime scene, or evidence that the shell casing could be traced to Hussong's gun, or that it was fired on the day of the crime. The defense attorney wanted his client's rifle and shell casings removed from evidence. The judge denied all the defense attorney's motions, since the state had provided significant evidence to show the likelihood that Brian Hussong committed the crime. While the cause of Neil LaFave's death was imprecise, the judge said he was murdered in the most violent way, and the trial would continue. The defense called firearms expert Stanton Berg to the stand. Stanton was from Minneapolis and had studied the wounding effects of bullets. The defense asked hypothetical questions about Site 2, where there had been tissue and blood splatter found on trees several feet off the ground. Stanton said that a high-velocity bullet fired at any distance would create entry and exit wounds. This would not blow off the back of a person's head, like the type of injury that Neil LaFave sustained. The firearms expert said that a rifle would not cause that injury, but a shotgun placed in contact with the head could cause that injury. Under cross-examination, Stanton said that a high-velocity rifle that was placed in contact with a person's head could cause an expelling effect and would likely mask entrance and exit wounds. Stanton agreed with the prosecution's firearms expert that the shell casings found at Site 2 were from a Remington Model 760 rifle, which Brian Hussong owned. The 4 slugs found at the crime scene were all fired from the same gun, but they couldn't say entirely with authority that they were fired from Brian Hussong's gun. After a few hours of deliberating, the jury convicted Brian Hussong of first-degree murder. On the way out of the courtroom, Hussong threatened the prosecutor. "I'll kill you, you little son of a bitch." He also threatened the officers that escorted him to prison. "If I ever get out, what happened to Neil LaFave will look like child's play compared to what I'll do to you." Hussong was sentenced to life in prison and initially served his time in Green Bay. In March 1974, Hussong appealed his conviction, but the Wisconsin Supreme Court upheld it. The wiretapping of the phone was one of the items challenged, but the court supported the judge's decision to allow that evidence to be used in the case. When Hussong first arrived at prison, he was threatening other inmates. He was subsequently diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and his behavior improved dramatically after he was medicated. In July 1979, they transferred Hussong to Waupun Correctional, which was a maximum security prison. Hussong remained well-behaved, so in November 1980, he was transferred to Fox Lake Correctional, which was a medium security prison. This was customary for inmates to move to a lower security prison as they approached their parole hearing, and their behavior remained acceptable. Hussong was approximately 2 years away from his first parole hearing, but this good behavior didn't last long. On Friday, August 28, 1981, Brian Hussong escaped from Fox Lake Correctional Institution. He simply cut through the chain-link fence with a wire cutter. Inmate checks took place at 9 p.m., and that's when they realized he was gone. They estimated he escaped 30 to 60 minutes before prison checks. Staff could not find the wire cutter when they searched the prison grounds. The speculation was that Hussong headed to Green Bay, but they were uncertain. They communicated the message to the public that Brian Hussong escaped from prison. He had a stocky build at 5 foot 9 inches and 180 pounds. He had dark brown hair, blue eyes, blue jeans, and a blue jacket, and they considered him to be very dangerous. Hayward, Wisconsin was a 4.5-hour drive northwest of the Fox Lake Correctional Prison. On Sunday, August 30th, 1981, 2 patrol cars with the Hayward police watched a man drive erratically down the street. They thought they were dealing with a run-of-the-mill drunk driver who had a female passenger in the car. One officer called in the license plate, and it was registered to a Sheboygan woman. The man reached under the seat to grab a bottle of alcohol, and police thought it was time to pull the car over. They did not know that Brian Hussong was driving, and that he reached under the seat to grab his pistol. Hussong got out of the car, and when the officer asked for his driver's license, he hit the police officer in the face. Hussong jumped back in his vehicle, and as he peeled away, he ran over the second officer's foot, breaking it. Then he slammed into the second patrol car, which was trying to prevent him from driving away. This didn't stop Hussong, and he kept going. By this time, the incident had been called in, and a roadblock was being set up. Hussong drove towards the roadblock, and instead of ramming another cop car, he pulled over and ran into the woods. He left his female companion in the car to deal with the police. 36-year-old woman told officers that her name was Linda View, and she wasn't willing to help the investigators. She claimed she just met the man on the run outside of Hayward. He was hitchhiking, and she picked him up. When officers searched Linda and her car, they found 2 knives and a receipt in her purse for a handgun. Hayward law enforcement and the prison administration at Fox Lake Correctional communicated the next day. It was only then that they understood that the man who ran into the woods was prison escapee Brian Hussong. And the woman with him was the same person who visited him in prison on the day he escaped. Her real name was Mary Conrad, or at least that was who she signed into prison as on that Friday night of the escape. Mary and Hussong knew each other because she wrote him often in prison. During her visit, they finalized escape plans. She tossed the wire cutters over the prison fence in an area that was obscured from the view of the prison guards. Mary sat in her car with her lights off, waiting for Hussong. She even removed her overhead light so Hussong could get into her car without being seen. Then they both drove the 4.5 hours to Hayward, Wisconsin. After further investigation, they realized that Mary Conrad had taken Linda View's driver's license and social security card so she could assume her identity. Police initially held her on an outstanding bad check warrant, plus obstruction for not cooperating with investigators. They ultimately charged Mary Conrad for her role in helping with Brian Hussong's escape. She pleaded no contest and was convicted of aiding and abetting. Mary was sentenced to 2 years and was sent to Taycheedah Correctional Institution to serve her time. On Monday, August 31st, 1981, an officer spotted a car that had just been reported stolen. He followed the car for a while, but the driver pulled over and fled into the woods. As the manhunt in Hayward continued, many of the residents were tense. People with police scanners listened with careful ears. Doors were locked, and rifles were loaded. The Sawyer County Sheriff in Hayward wasn't kidding when he said, "Anybody who wants to get shot, they better just start running around in the woods up here in Sawyer County. We are not playing around." Lots of tips and purported sightings of Brian Hussong flooded into sheriff's departments in several cities around Wisconsin and even Michigan, but no one was really certain where he was. Brian Hussong continued to evade capture. On Thursday, September 3rd, 1981, 4 hours southeast of Hayward, in the small village of Pulaski, a bank was robbed and $27,000 was taken. There had been a large amount of money at the bank that day because of lunchtime deposits they received from a local business. They also had extra money on hand, as it was the day people cashed their Social Security checks. Investigators weren't sure, but they suspected Brian Hussong. When the Sawyer County Sheriff was asked if he thought Hussong committed the robbery, he said, "You better believe it." But this was never proven. On October 11th, 1981, the Green Bay Press-Gazette ran a front-page story called "Prison Turned Hussong from Shocked Kid into Bitter Man." Hussong's mom said, "Of course Brian is bitter. He has a good reason. He is not guilty. I never missed a visit while he was in prison, and he sometimes talked about how he got the shaft. It was rigged from the beginning. If he was the brutal man that they make him out to be, by now he would have put a gun to someone's head and forced them to take him to Canada. Then he would have shot them. But that hasn't happened because he isn't like that." Brian Hussong's trail was cold for October and November, but rumors circulated that he was living in the woods. Hussong did some time with 2 Native American brothers. Their dad owned land on the Stockbridge-Muncie Reservation, an hour southwest of Green Bay in Shawano County. In early December 1981, there was an incident in the forest. A pulpwood dealer was involved in a confrontation with a man who fired a shot into the ground next to his feet. They warned the pulpwood dealer to be careful around this person because they killed the game warden in Suamico. Investigators flew a plane over the area and learned that Hussong was staying at a shack that was set back 1.5 miles from the nearest road. On December 8th and 9th, 7 agencies came together with a team of 50 officers, and they made a plan to capture Brian Hussong. They had several officers set up a perimeter around the shack and set up roadblocks so he wouldn't be able to escape in a car. Law enforcement was also aware that Hussong had been off his medication for a few months, so they expected him to be erratic. On December 10th, 1981, investigators used a search warrant and confirmed with one of the Native American brothers that Hussong was at his shack. An officer got on a bullhorn and asked Hussong to surrender. Brian Hussong swore he'd never be captured alive, and he kept his promise as he ignored the 5 verbal warnings to surrender. Hussong stepped back inside his shack, grabbed his .30-06 rifle, and pointed it at law enforcement. He was shot to death by police in a hail of gunfire. Police shot him with handguns and rifles. Hussong fell to the ground, but was still alive. He pointed his rifle at one officer who was closest to him. The officer had a 12-gauge shotgun, which was loaded with buckshot, and he fired a round into Hussong. Brian Hussong died in the ambulance ride to the hospital. They shot him in the face, neck, upper chest, and hands. Inside of his shack, investigators found knives, a Remington 870 12-gauge shotgun, a large amount of ammo, and a sandwich. Hussong had a half-eaten deer hanging from a nearby tree and had pinned a skinned squirrel to another tree. Hussong had been preparing to spend all winter in a shack, and he would have had the survival skills to make it happen. In the end, law enforcement ruled the shooting justifiable. Many law enforcement officers, prison guards, prosecutors, judges, and jury members had all been threatened by Brian Hussong. He promised to kill every member of the jury who convicted him. The district attorney sent his wife and kids to stay at their vacation home for the duration of Hussong's escape. 2 Hayward game wardens did not realize how close they came to being shot. They were searching by a brush pile back in August when Hussong escaped. Before he died, Hussong told his Native American accomplice that he was hiding in that brush pile with a pistol, debating if he should shoot the wardens. He opted not to because he thought that the 2-on-1 situation might result in a shootout. Once news of Brian Hussong's death spread across Wisconsin, there was a collective sigh of relief. Neil LaFave's murder took place over 50 years ago, but it was a case not forgotten in Wisconsin. His legacy lives on in different forms, from the granite marker placed in the Sensiba Wildlife Area by his wife Peggy, to the Madison, Wisconsin Law Enforcement Memorial, where Neil's name was engraved. In 2020, LaFave's daughter, Nikki DeGrief, worked to get a boat landing renamed after her father. When locals launch their boat off of Sunset Beach Road in Suamico, they are greeted by the sign that reads, "Welcome to Neil L. LaFave Suamico Boat Launch, Brown County Park System." Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. Please visit beyondcontemptpodcast.com for the links to the sources and music used in this episode. Research, writing, editing, audio production, and sound design were performed by me, Renee. If you like the show, please leave me a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you so much, everyone.